Hi, everybody. This is More, the Management of Reality. We are in our English language podcast, and the topic today, hi, Yoel, how are you doing?
Hi
The,
everyone.
the topic today is the Muslim takeover of Europe. It's happening. It's something that all Westerners need to take seriously. There has been a lot of discussion lately on this topic because this is a problem that is reaching what you might call critical mass. And a lot of people are becoming aware that Europe is on the brink of civil war. And this is something that I've been saying in my conferences. I said it in my conferences in Spain when I was there about a year ago. I explained that very little time remains for Europe. The civil wars are definitely coming. They cannot be avoided because the Muslims want them. And there are more Muslims in Europe all the time because the policies of the Western bosses have been to produce this demographic change in the West in favor of Islam. So these civil wars are coming. There's nothing can stop them. Nothing. They're going to happen. The only question now is how soon will they happen? Because that's a critical aspect of this. I believe that if the civil wars for the defense of Europe happen in say 5 or 10 years, then descendants of Judeo-Christian Westerners will lose. The only chance of winning is if these civil wars erupt pretty much in the next few months. In the next two, they should happen in the next 2 years for the Europeans to have any chance at winning, because otherwise the demographic change, which is happening so rapidly as a result of the natural growth of Muslim populations in Europe, the accelerated immigration, both legal and illegal, of Muslims into Europe, and also the rapid radicalization of these Muslims as a result of the activity of the mosques that Western bosses have allowed the jihadi states to build in Europe, right? As a result of all of that, the Muslim pressure is growing very, very fast. Meanwhile, the traditional Judeo-Christian Europeans are reproducing very slowly. In fact, there's a population collapse going on among them in Europe. So there's a very if Europe can still be saved, then the window of opportunity is very narrow. And so my prediction is, if the civil wars happen right away, like in the next few months to, I think max, I don't know how to put an exact number on this, but I'm thinking, more than 2 or 3 years of waiting for these civil wars to happen, I think is giving too much of an advantage to the jihadis. And in that case, we will lose Europe, or at least a good chunk of Europe.
Wow.
So this is the situation we're in right now, and more people are commenting on this because the visual aspect of what is going on is impossible to deny. We are a very visual species, and so the visual stimuli are therefore processed with great immediacy and emotional impact. And so when people see these scenes, for example, in London, I have a friend who is just in London, and what she tells me is, look, you walk outside in London, and you really need to pay attention to the buildings to remind yourself that you're in the West, because you see so many burqas and chadors and men from obviously Muslim countries walking around, that it becomes overwhelming. I mean, you think to yourself, wow, where did the traditional Europeans go? And the same thing is happening in places like Barcelona. It's happening in Paris. It's happening in Portugal. It's not just one place. Belgium looks like it's overrun by Brussels looks like it's been overrun by Muslims, right? And so, and then you have these interesting political developments. Some of them highly symbolic. So, for example, it is possible that our audience is very aware of this, but people who don't usually consume this kind of content may not know anything about this, which is that there's been a recent flag war going on in Britain. So there were two cases of local authorities. One of them was Birmingham, I believe. The other one was something Towers. But anyway, two local governments in Britain started taking down British flags because they apparently consider the British flag racist. You know, this is one of the arguments. They consider the British flag divisive. Somehow the British flag is becoming politically incorrect, and controversial for the British government authorities. And so there were these incidents where people were putting up some English flags and some British flags, the Union Jack. Local governments were taking them down because of for these reasons that apparently if you're proud of England or proud of Britain or proud of Scotland, then you're automatically considered a racist by these British bureaucrats. They immediately interpret that as some kind of malfeasance, that you're raising the British flag. So they're taking them down. But what's sacred to these local authorities in Britain is the Palestinian flag. So that one stays up. No matter where they put it up, that one stays up. And actually, they are careful to guard those flags so that other people don't take them down. So a lot of Britons said to themselves, well, this is, first of all, very strange, but it's also unacceptable. I mean, how can it be that the government is protecting the Palestinian flag, which is not merely a foreign flag, it's the banner of a terrorist genocidal entity? So it's absurd and offensive that the British, any part of the British government or a British local government should be protecting the Palestinian flag and taking down the flags of Britain. So in reply to this, there was a grassroots movement that called itself Operation Raise the Colors. And people can go look about that. You can look that up in the internet, Operation Raise the Colors. And what they started doing is they started organizing, among themselves to get British flags so that they could drape them over lampposts, bridges, buildings, anything, just put a flag of Britain on it, or a flag of England, a flag of Scotland, any surface would do, to express this. These are Britons expressing that they're proud of their own country and that they don't appreciate the British government pretending that there's something wrong with Britain. So this event is a symbol of symbols, but it's also a symptom, right? It's a symptom. And given that the Palestinian flag now represents Muslim power, and that it is raised all over the West and waved all over the West to intimidate Westerners, I think this whole event is a symptom it's a symptom of something. And we should perhaps ask whether it is not a symptom that Islam has already taken Britain. Okay, when you have the British government protecting a flag that is a symbol of Muslim power and taking down the flag of Britain, of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom, the Union Jack, you have to wonder, well, doesn't this mean that there's been a Muslim takeover of Britain? Is that too far-fetched? A lot of people seem to think that is not far-fetched, right? And this flag war, this battle of the flags, is not the only reason. There are plenty of reasons. If you wish, the one of the, if you think, diagnostic signals that something is deeply wrong in Great Britain, somewhat subtle, is that Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, came out to say that he was proud of the British flag. You know, in the context of this controversy, the British Prime Minister felt obliged to clarify that he is in favor of the British flag. This is completely ridiculous. Is he going to defend the right of Britain to exist next? You know, this is what we've come to. But I think the clearest signal that there is something deeply at work here, and that perhaps the British government has been lost, is that there's been a controversy, and this is obviously much more serious than just a bunch of flags, right? There's been a controversy raging for some time now about the Pakistani rape gangs in Great Britain. Now, this is a tremendous scandal. Why? Because these are gangs of Pakistani men who were raping working class girls, working class white girls in Great Britain. Of course, the rapes themselves are a scandal. It's a criminal organization that is preying on innocent girls. But what makes this scandal so much deeper, so much more offensive, is that the criminal activity of these rape gangs was known to the police, it was known to the social workers, it was known to all kinds of politicians. It was not exactly a secret. It was known to all of these different bureaucrats and politicians, and yet they did nothing. They did absolutely nothing for a long, long time. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why would you not prosecute rape gangs, right? Now, The Guardian, if you want an example of mealy-mouthed English nonsense, The Guardian explained this official culpability of British authorities in this massive crime as follows. They said, and I quote, "Authorities have shied away from," that's the words they used, "shied away from the ethnicity of grooming gangs, allowing the continued abuse of hundreds of vulnerable girls, many of whom are now demanding justice." I don't know how one shies away from someone's ethnicity. That way of talking just seems perfectly incoherent to me. But whatever it means, whatever this nonsense phrase means, how can shying away from ethnicity explain that British authorities allowed these rape gangs to operate and to prey on all of these white girls, right? That's just gobbledygook. It's just the English nonsense. And the reason they talk like this is that they're trying to obscure the simple description of the truth. The simple description of the truth is that British authorities did nothing because the criminals were Muslim. That's the truth. Okay? Because British authorities have no problem prosecuting white British citizens for virtually nothing. I mean, so lately there have been all kinds of scandals, at least in podcast space, which is where these things are denounced. There have been all kinds of scandals about Britons getting thrown in jail for expressing their opinions in a tweet or in a Facebook post. Okay? So if it's an opinion, if you in Great Britain, the locus classicus of modern Western freedom, right? That's where modern Western freedom began. In Great Britain. Great Britain was the first country to execute a king. It was one of the first countries to allow religious freedom. It was the first country to subject the king to parliamentary control, right? In that country, they are now throwing people in jail for expressing an opinion online. So long as it's a white Briton expressing an opinion about some minority or some movement, and so long as the British government believes that they can make a case that what the person expressed is hateful, right? So they have these laws against hate speech. As other people have said, hate speech laws should not exist because freedom of speech was invented to protect hate speech. So the very thing, the strategy that the British government is using and that other governments around the world are using, other governments around the West are using, is that you can have your free speech. You have free speech. Speak freely, but you can't be hateful. You can't say hateful things, right? So obviously this destroys free speech because practically anything that you say complaining about anyone in any way can be constructed to be hate speech if the government wants to do that. And what that means is that you no longer have the freedom to talk. So if you can't express opinions about particular movements or particular groups online in a tweet, because that might get you thrown in jail, you're no longer living in a free country. And if this is happening only or mostly to whites who complain about some sacred woke category, if you're because this is happening when people in Britain complain about the trans ideology, or when they complain about the operations that they do on kids, or any kind of complaint against the activities of very ideological members of the LGBTQ community, or if you're complaining about the intimidation that people are suffering in the streets from Muslims or anything like that, police officers show up at your door and they arrest you and they throw you in jail. But if Muslim rape gangs at the same time get away with it, because the British authorities do not want to offend the Muslim community, right? They're worried that they will be accused of Islamophobia if they prosecute Muslim rape gangs that are preying on white working class girls in Great Britain, right? If these two things are happening at the same time, right? You tweet against Muslims, you go to jail, but Muslim rape gangs that violate white girls, those can operate because the British government is afraid of hearing that it is Islamophobic, right? Well, in that case, the boss is the Muslim community. They're the boss. In which case, it makes sense to say that we have a Muslim takeover of Britain. I mean, what else are you going to say? That's the diagnostic symptom. If Muslims can commit any kind of crime, even rape, because the British government will not prosecute them, and they can intimidate non-Muslims in the streets of Great Britain, which they're doing, and they can establish Sharia Sharia courts in Great Britain, which they're also doing, right? Well, then it becomes reasonable to say that there is a Muslim takeover of Great Britain, right? So I want to give you some historical depth on this process because it's necessary. And I'm going to talk to you about an event in 2006 that I believe was pivotal. It was the moment when Western leaders signaled to Muslims, and in particular to Muslim leaders, Muslim bosses, that they would not defend the West from Islam. Okay, 2006 was a crucial moment in which Western bosses made it perfectly clear that they would not defend the West. And that moment was in December 2006, when Pope Benedict XVI traveled to Turkey to apologize to Islam for something he had said. Okay? You know how the woke movement has been conditioning us to apologize every time somebody calls us a racist, right? Every time the woke crowd accuses you of being a racist, oh, you have to make a big apology, and you have to genuflect and say that you didn't mean it and you're never going to do it again, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter whether the accusation is reasonable or unreasonable. It doesn't matter whether it's true or untrue. The only thing that matters is that people want to be made safe from these kinds of cancellation, mob attacks. And so they've been conditioning us over a few decades to quickly apologize if we feel that there's some kind of mass accusation against something we said. And that what the Pope did in late 2006 has that kind of structure. So here's the context of what happened. Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, gave a lecture called the Regensburg Lecture. Regensburg University, I believe this was, in which the Pope argued that true faith must be united with reason, okay? And therefore, religious violence, and especially Islam, should be rejected. So all religions, he said, should reject religious violence because it is irrational and contrary to God's nature, So, and especially Islam with jihad needs to reject violence and embrace rational dialogue, okay? So the Pope said these things, and in the middle of saying these things, in the middle of making this, blanket rejection of the union of violence with religion, and of making this special criticism of Islam, Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, quoted a Byzantine emperor from the 14th century. Now, what is a Byzantine emperor? Byzantium is the Eastern Roman Empire with its capital in Constantinople, which is the earlier name of the city that is now called Istanbul. Okay, it is now called Istanbul because it belongs to the Turks, because the Ottoman Turks conquered the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium. Byzantium is the ancient name of Constantinople. And they changed the name, so now it's called Istanbul, right? So, what Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, did in that speech I'm discussing is he quoted an emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire from the 14th century, who said that some of Prophet Muhammad's teachings were evil, quote unquote, evil and inhuman. Okay, that's what the Pope said. Now, the emperor that he quoted is, as I said, from the 14th century, and therefore from the very latest period of the Eastern Roman Empire, which was a Christian Orthodox empire. Okay, the religion that Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire protected and husbanded was Eastern Orthodoxy. Eastern Christian Orthodoxy. Now, this is 14th century, so it's the very last stage. In the next century, in the 15th century, the Ottomans would finish destroying the Byzantine Empire. Okay, they would finish destroying it. So the emperor that was quoted by the Pope is an emperor who's being attacked by jihadi Ottoman Muslims who are destroying the Eastern Roman Empire, and he is witnessing the incredible violence with which jihadi Muslims wage war, right? So it is in this context that the Byzantine Roman Emperor said, well, it seems to me that Muhammad's teachings are evil and inhuman. There's no compassion in this. There's no sense of common human brotherhood, nothing. These people are just savaging us, right? And in the next century, as I said, the Ottoman Muslims would finish destroying the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Ottomans, after destroying the Eastern Roman Empire, would continue advancing relentlessly into Europe, okay, enslaving the Christians and the Jews until in the late 17th century, they were finally stopped by King John III Sobieski of Poland. It's a very, very famous moment in the history of the West. King John III Sobieski was the king of Poland. He came charging down to defend Vienna. Vienna was being sieged by the Ottoman Turks, and John Sobieski came with his famous hussars, his cavalry, and he broke the siege of Vienna, and this halted the Muslim advance into Europe. Finally halted the Muslim advance into Europe. The Ottomans still managed to conquer all of the Balkans, right? The countries we now call Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, a part of Hungary, everything that was the former Yugoslavia, all of that was conquered by the Ottoman Turks. But at least they were stopped at the gates of Vienna by the Polish king John Sobieski, and after that, the Austro-Hungarian kingdom managed to keep the Ottomans more or less at bay, managed to keep them from continuing to invade Europe. And the hard work there was done mostly by the Serbs. So the Austrian Empire settled a large population of Serbs, because the Serbs were doing a very good job fighting against the Ottoman Muslims. And so a lot of Serbs were settled in an area of what is now Croatia that is called the Krajina. And these Krajina Serbs were the special soldiers defending the West from the Muslim advance, okay? And if you read histories of this, historians generally say that here Christendom was saved from Muslim conquest, thanks to John Sobieski, right? And this is why John Sobieski is called, the title by which he is remembered is Savior of Christendom, okay? But the question now is whether Christendom was really saved, or was the Western defeat merely postponed? That's the question. And I think we're about to find out. So Yoel sent me a message asking me, hey, Francisco, it's kind of strong for you to say that there's no way to prevent the civil wars in Europe. Might there be some way to avoid it? Isn't that a very strong statement? And I believe the answer is no. I believe that perhaps the civil wars can be won, which would be a good thing for the West. But I don't think. I think the chances that they can be avoided are low, because the Muslims want them. The Muslims are. I'm sorry, I have to connect myself because I'm running out of battery. Give me a second. We are hearing from the Muslims that they're going to take over Europe. That's what they say in their, when they're out in the streets intimidating us. That's what they say. So, and that's what the mosques preach. So the Muslim clerics all over Europe are preaching jihad. So, maybe it takes two to tango, but it only takes one side to provoke a civil war. I mean, if one of the two sides is hell-bent on producing a civil war, and they're going to attack you no matter what, well, then sooner or later you're going to have a war, because sooner or later the other side will decide to defend itself. So unfortunately, I don't think this can be avoided. I think the only question that remains is, when is it going to happen? And we're about to find out. And it seems like it's going to be sooner rather than later. But the question is whether in this conflict that we're now in, the Western bosses are going to be fighting on our side or on the side of the jihadis. Okay, are the Western bosses fighting the jihad, or will they fight the jihad, or are they collaborating with it? That's the question, and it's a question we must ask, because this event of 2006, in my view, sent a clear signal that the Western bosses are not fighting on our side. This is what happened. So the Pope made these statements in his Regensburg speech, right, about the violence of Islam and all this stuff, and how it's important to separate violence from religion. And then he quoted that Byzantine emperor saying that, in his opinion, Islam was, what did he say? He said it was evil and inhuman, right? That's what the emperor said. So Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI quotes this, and there's a Muslim uproar. Okay, there is a tremendous wave of expressed Muslim outrage at the fact that the Pope said these things. Immediately after the outrage began, just a week after, the Pope made a public apology. This is remarkable. Just 1 week later, the Los Angeles Times was reporting, and I quote, "In his first public appearance since igniting a firestorm in the Islamic world, Pope Benedict XVI on Sunday said he was deeply sorry that Muslims were offended and outraged by his use of a medieval citation critical of their faith, saying it did not, quote, in any way express my personal thought," end of quote. That's quite the backpedaling. But that was not enough, apparently. That was evidently not humiliating enough that the Pope made a comment about Islam that is perfectly reasonable, because it's not as if the people who make law in the Islamic tradition and who comment on Islamic law and on the foundations of Islamic law have not said similar things, right? And I'm going to talk about some of that in a second, right? So, but the Pope says this, and there's a firestorm of outrage in the Islamic world, and immediately the Pope apologizes and says, "Oh no, I didn't mean it, and I don't agree with that emperor anyway." That was not humiliating enough. Why do I say that? Because just a few days later, there was a second clarification by the Catholic Church. Civiltà Católica, which is a Jesuit publication that, together with L'Osservatore Romano, works as an official publication of the Catholic Church, an official publication of the Vatican. Civiltà Católica, yes, it's a Jesuit journal, which is to say that the Jesuit order is in charge of the publication, but every article is carefully checked and vetted by the Vatican Secretary of State. Okay, so everything that's published in Civiltà Católica has the seal of approval of the Pope. It's an official journal of the Vatican. Okay, and in Civiltà Católica, right after this, they published an editorial, which, though it didn't mention Pope Benedict's remarks, implicitly had this, what the Pope meant to say kind of structure, and what they did with this editorial, it was immediately attacked by some Catholics as a scandalous and humiliating surrender to Islam. Now, why? Because this editorial correctly described that Islam is aiming at the conquest of the world and is fostered by violence. Okay, so they frankly discussed the violent aspect of jihadism. But what bothered many Catholics is that this editorial offered no critique of that. It only offered accommodation to the fact that Islam is increasingly becoming more and more violent, right? So Whereas the Pope earlier in his Regensburg speech had denounced any relationship between violence and religion, now the editorial in Civiltà Cattolica seemed more like a manifesto of multicultural theories. Right? It seemed like a woke manifesto, and basically what the editorial is saying is, well, Islam is violent, but that's the way it is. We have to accept them. It's their culture. They're violent. We got to be tolerant. Their culture is violence. We have a different culture. They have their own. Everybody has to tolerate the other nation's culture, the other religion's culture, etc. It was that kind of a thing. And even worse than that, the editorial in Civiltà Cattolica interpreted the anti-Western jihad in Muslim terms. So they interpret the Muslim jihad, the anti-Western Muslim jihad, as a legitimate reaction to Western provocations. So they do all the song and dance about, the West was an imperialist colonizer, and Muslims feel that any and according to Muslim law that requires a violent response, and jihad and blah blah blah. So it's really our fault because what were we doing colonizing? Blah, blah. It's this kind of argument, okay, which is exactly what the argument that Muslims defend in Western spaces, because it's the kind of argument that can move Western guilt in favor of Islam, right? So if Muslims tell us, oh look, we are jihadis because we just want to kill you. We're anybody who's an infidel who doesn't want to convert to Islam according to our law must be killed, and that's why we're going to kill you, because you're stubborn and you don't want to learn, you don't want to convert to Islam, so we're going to kill you. If they said that, it would become a lot harder to mobilize Westerners in favor of Islam. But if they say, look, you were subjecting us to colonial subject status for a while, and we are resentful of that, and that's why we attack you. Well, then, given the indoctrination that so many Westerners have been receiving in their universities about the guilt of the West and the imperative that Westerners must redeem their guilt as former imperialists and colonizers, etc. On the basis of that framework, if Muslims tell us, yeah, we are violent Muslims because you were once our colonizers, that kind of argument can work to make many Westerners sort of understanding of Muslim violence, right? And this is the argument that the church defended. The church, it's exactly the same argument, right? In those very terms. And this is really, it's really quite remarkable to see the church doing that. And the editorial in Civiltà Cattolica also defended jihadi views on democracy and the Arab-Israeli conflict. In other words, it basically said, democracy is not compatible with Muslim culture, and they have a different view of human rights. So, got to tolerate that. And they also defended the jihadi view on the Arab-Israeli conflict, interpreting that, the Jews stole the land of the Arab Palestinians, according to the Catholic Church. And therefore, the only way to solve that conflict, according to this editorial, would be to destroy Israel. They didn't quite say that, but they got very close to saying that, okay? So, this editorial in Civiltà Cattolica is a kind of a second apology. So first you get the Pope literally saying, I'm sorry, and I didn't mean it, and I don't agree with that emperor I quoted, so let's make believe I didn't say it, because, in reality, I believe the opposite. And I don't know why I said that, it's a bit like that. It was like, I had a moment of temporary insanity. I don't really mean everything I said. I believe the opposite. And then Civiltà Cattolica comes out, which is it's officially speaking for the papacy, and it comes out with this amazing editorial. But the Vatican was not quite done. The Muslims were still very upset by everything the Pope had said, and they didn't feel that the Pope had apologized enough. So this is why I say that this has the structure of the woke universe, because in the woke universe, even when you apologize for something that offended the woke crowd, they never agree that you have apologized enough. You have to keep apologizing, and no apology is sufficient, right? They keep hitting you over the head no matter how many times you apologize. So it has that kind of structure. The Pope comes out, he says, I'm sorry. Then Civiltà Católica comes out and says, yeah, it's okay to be a violent Muslim, right? And still they're not done. So they decided that they would make a trip, they would organize a trip for the Pope to go to Turkey and keep apologizing. So they sent the Pope to Istanbul, and in Istanbul, the Pope did the following three things. I'm going to read you how this was reported in Los Angeles Times. Quote, in his first public appearance since igniting a firestorm in the Islamic world, Pope Benedict XVI on Sunday said he was deeply sorry that Muslims were offended and outraged by his use of a medieval citation critical of their... Oh, forgive me, that's not the one. Forgive me. I already read you that one. No, the one I want you to read is the one I want to read you is the description of the Pope's visit to Istanbul. Forgive me. And that was reported, what I'm reading to you was reported in the Jerusalem Post, forgive me. And it says, quote, during his visit to Istanbul, Pope Benedict XVI backed Turkey's admission into the EU, into the European Union, prayed toward Mecca in a mosque, and called Islam a religion of peace, tolerance, and love. End of quote. So now this is the capstone to the Pope's apology. Okay, so he travels to Istanbul in the middle of this controversy, and he says Turkey should be part of Europe. Now, you should know that in 2006, which is when this happened, there was already a bunch of work done to document what was happening demographically in Europe, because it was happening very fast, and a lot of people were getting worried about this. So by 2006, which is when the Pope goes to Istanbul, well, you already had large Turkish communities established all across the European Union, and they were growing very rapidly through family reunification and also through addition of new migrants. But it wasn't just Turks coming in from Turkey into Europe. By 2006, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, a bunch of European Union reports and also academic studies were already describing Turkey as a key smuggling and migration hub into the European Union, whether legal or illegal. Many Muslims were coming in already by 2006, particularly from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and also Turkey. And they're all coming in through Turkey, right? Turkey is the big gateway into Europe. And despite the fact that this is happening and that it's already being commented with urgency and some alarm in different places, the Pope says he wants Turkey integrated into the European Union, which of course would have brought an even greater flood of Muslims into Europe. And to anyone paying close attention, it was obvious that that Turkey had a policy to flood Europe with Muslims. It was very obvious. They were not controlling the border at all. And later it became even more obvious because Erdogan, the Turkish president, in public made it clear that he was going to use the Muslim immigration into Europe as a power lever to force concessions from the European Union. And the European Union eventually ended up paying Erdogan a lot of money, ostensibly so that Erdogan would control the border and would manage the flow of Muslims into Europe. So Erdogan has a policy to use this as a power lever. And in spite of all that, here's the Pope saying, I want Turkey in the European Union, which of course amounts to the Pope signaling that he favors a demographic transition toward Islam in Europe. The head of the Catholic Church, right? The other thing that the Pope did in Istanbul is that he, quote, prayed toward Mecca in a mosque, unquote. I can't even begin to tell you how remarkable this is. Let me quote the description. Quote, in deference to Muslim custom, this is the Los Angeles Times speaking. It says, quote, in deference to Muslim custom, Benedict removed his red leather shoes before walking into the building, and Kagrici, the mufti, this is the Muslim religious official in charge of the mosque, led Benedict through the mosque, reaching the mihrab or niche that faces Mecca. There, the two men paused in silent reverence. The Pope folded his arms over his midsection, just below the large golden cross dangling from his neck, cast his eyes downward, and finally bowed his head as the turbaned mufti, standing at his side, said a brief prayer. End of quote. So the Pope is here. What's the word? He is shepherded by a Muslim religious authority into the mosque and instructed and led to behave as a good Muslim. And in fact, the Mufti later told the press, he congratulated the Pope on praying like a good Muslim. In the Middle Ages, any Christian, let alone a priest, let alone the Pope, might have burned hotly at the stake for doing this kind of thing, for praying towards Mecca barefoot in a mosque. I mean, and of course, the message for distracted Westerners that they hear in the media about all this is that the Pope is being ecumenical, right? That he's reaching out to other faiths, that this is a healing moment in, for example, the Guardian's interpretation, right? The Guardian called it a healing moment, and it said, quote, it was a striking demonstration of a point the Pope had made repeatedly during his visit to Turkey, that Christians and Muslims worship the same God, end of quote. Now, you can pull wool over the eyes of Westerners and tell them, oh, this is the Pope having an ecumenical moment, this is the Pope being tolerant of other faiths. But to understand how Muslims see it, you have to think like a Muslim. Muslims don't think like Westerners, all right? So the way Muslims interpret this is that the Pope is submitting to Islam. That's how they interpret it, that they are winning the ideological war, okay? And the Pope understands this. The Pope is not, the Pope is not an average Joe. The Pope is a highly educated individual, one of the most highly educated individuals on the entire planet, okay? He is the Pope. And the Pope is a world leader. He directs the Catholic Church, which is a major world religion, and he is a head of state. So the Vatican is itself a state, and it has embassies all over the world, okay? The Pope is an incredibly, incredibly powerful dude, and he is playing for world power. His behaviors are not random. They are not trivial. They are not superficial. Every papal behavior is pregnant with meaning and carefully decided and coldly calculated and performed. The Pope knew exactly how Muslims would interpret his behavior because the Pope understands Islam as he demonstrated in his Regensburg speech, right? So the Pope knows that him praying barefoot in the Blue Mosque of Istanbul toward Mecca under the instruction of a Muslim religious cleric, and then congratulated by that cleric on having prayed like a good Muslim, right? All of that means that the Pope is submitting to Islam. That's how they interpret it. So the message the Pope sent is that the Western bosses would not defend the West. remember the structure. The Pope said something that is true about Islam. Muslims reacted with outrage, right? And then the Pope issued an apology, issued a second apology through Civiltà Cattolica, reassured Muslims that it's okay that they're violent, right? Because they have a just grievance with the West, and the West should adapt to the feelings of Muslims, right? The Pope said all of that. And then he went into the Blue Mosque of Istanbul after saying that Turkey should join the EU, and he prayed toward Mecca from within the mosque. There's only one way for Muslim minds to interpret that. The message means we, the Western bosses, submit to Islam. We will not defend the West. But the Pope was not done. In a public declaration, still on his Istanbul trip, the Pope publicly called Islam, and I quote, a religion of peace, tolerance, and love. In that message, Islam is the religion of peace, is the message that Western bosses have been giving Westerners over and over again for the past decades. For more than a century now, Westerners have been hearing from their own authorities that jihadism is supposedly a distortion of the true message of Islam. That jihadism is supposedly a minority movement that is led by radical clerics and their followers who don't understand what is the true message of the Quran, and who don't understand the true message of the Hadith, and therefore have distorted what is a beautiful message of peace, tolerance, and love into a message of holy war and intolerance and subjugation and death for infidels. Okay? That's the message we've been hearing. We're supposed to believe that the jihadis are a minority radical movement that is distorting the true nature of Islam, and we're supposed to embrace Islam as the religion of peace. That's what the Pope said. And the entirety of his message was, we, the Western bosses, will not defend Islam. Now, is the subsequent behavior of Western bosses in Europe consistent with this interpretation? Well, that's what we began with, right? We began this podcast with the topic of the Battle of the Flags going on in Great Britain, where the authorities in Great Britain remove British flags, but make sure to protect the Palestinian flag. So you've got the streets of London and other British cities and other European cities, right, full of Muslims chanting jihad, chanting free Palestine from the river to the sea, which is code for a jihadi extermination of the Israeli Jews, right? And the Palestinian flag stands for that. And the British government protecting the Palestinian flag, taking down the British flag, telling people that the British flag is racist. That's consistent. That's consistent with the message that Pope Benedict XVI gave to the Muslim world in 2006. So 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, the Pope gave the Muslim world a message that is consistent with the behavior of Western bosses. And I could give a long list of these behaviors, starting with the fact that Western bosses have allowed this massive wave of Muslim immigration into Europe. The fact that they have allowed the most radical jihadi states to finance the construction of mosques in Europe and to people those mosques with the clerics, with the radical clerics that they choose. Clerics that have been preaching to the Muslim populations in Europe that Europe is going to be theirs and that they need to protect for the jihad that's coming. So again, Yoel asks me, Francisco, are you really sure that the civil wars are coming? The answer is yes, they're definitely coming, because that's what the clerics are in these mosques that went up all over Europe are preaching to the Muslim faithful. And the way the social structure of Islam works is that once this kind of preaching starts and it reaches critical mass, if you're a Muslim and you're not getting aligned with this, you are treated as an infidel by other Muslims. So you have to get aligned, because otherwise you're in danger from your own community. This is what happens in all totalitarian movements. It was the same with the Nazis. Once the Nazis reach critical mass, even if you're a Nazi yourself, if you start deviating from the dogma, you immediately get in trouble. They can kill you. You have to make sure that you stay strictly within the dogma, whatever it is in the particular week you're in, because these things can shift quickly, right? Same in the communist movement. If you were in the Soviet Union, even if you were a member of the Communist Party, you're not safe. If you are perceived to deviate, if you have enemies within the party that want to accuse you of deviating, even if you didn't, then you're all of a sudden you're in danger, right? Yes, civil war is coming, because this is the dynamic we're already in, and we apparently have dramatic confirmation in recent events and in older events that Western bosses are not going to defend us. And the article we're going to publish tomorrow is going to do two things. It's going to explain exactly what Islam is from the point of view of the Muslim scholars that define what Islam is. Okay? If you want to know what Islam is, if you want to know how physics works, you don't go to an expert in marketing. That's not the expert that knows how physics works. That's not the guy you go ask. If you want to go understand Islam, you don't need the Pope. That's not the guy that explains Islam. The Pope is the guy that explains Catholicism, because the Pope literally defines Catholicism. The Pope is the authority that gets to say what Catholics are supposed to believe, what their dogmas are, what their articles of faith are. Okay, so if you want Catholicism defined, absolutely ask the Pope. He not only is very well learned in Catholicism, he gets to say what it is. He has the power to define it, right? In Islam, the people who have the power to define what Islam is are the Muslim scholars that are the mainstream authorities that everybody in Islam cites when they want to defend some particular point within the controversies that may or may not arise within Islam. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare what those Muslim scholars say, and these are going to be mainstream Muslim scholars, not fringe Muslim scholars. What do mainstream Muslim scholars say that Islam is, and what the place of jihad or holy war is within Islam? And we're going to compare that to what our Western authorities have been telling us that Islam is. Okay? And this will do two things. It will allow us to see what the true nature of Islam is, which is very important, because Islam is coming at us at 1,000,000 miles an hour per hour. Okay? It's coming at us like a rocket. And whatever the West is going to do about this, it's going to have to do it now. Okay, so we need to understand what Islam is. So the Muslim scholars are going to do that. They're going to tell us what Islam is. But from the way Western bosses talk about Islam, the things they want us Westerners to believe about Islam, and the contrast between that and what the Muslim scholars say Islam actually is, that will teach you what the Western bosses are actually doing to us and who they are really allied with. Okay? So those are the two things we're going to do in the article we will publish tomorrow. Look for it on our Substack page, and we can continue discussing it after its publication, because I think it's very important to really get in touch with this topic. So now I'm going to turn it over to Yoel to finish up, see if he has a question about all this, or if somebody in the audience contributed a question that it would be good to answer. And in any case, I will, if I don't see Yoel, it seems like we've lost Yoel. I don't know if he's still there. Apparently not. Apparently not. So I'm going to leave it here. Remember to subscribe, give us a like, hit that bell. It really helps us a lot to grow our audience, and share. We need all Westerners to become more familiar with the structure of our system and the direction it's going in. So please make sure that you're sharing with the people you know, starting the conversations we need to be having, and let us continue having these conversations, because we need to figure out what we're gonna do to contribute to the survival of the West, and how we're gonna adapt to everything that's going on. Okay, we're facing a bunch of challenges, and this is one of the most important ones. So please check out the article, and we will be back on this topic on our next podcast. And hopefully we will get some questions from you so that we can field them and continue to deepen our understanding of this topic. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next week on our English language podcast of Mondays. Bye-bye.